welcome. I'm Stan Grant. Also tonight, while the British government breaks a promise on tax cuts, we ask, would the government here get away with it? Here to answer your questions. He's been described as the brain of Britain, former Justice of the UK Supreme Court, Jonathan Sumption. Greens Deputy Leader, Mehreen Faruqi. Minister for Social Services, Amanda Rishworth. Former Socceroo and Chair of Professional Footballers Australia, Francis Awaritefe. And Group Chief Economist from the National Australia Bank, Alan Oster. Please make them welcome.
Andrew Thorburns' beliefs are not relevant to his role as Essendon CEO. It's his actions and behaviours that should be judged. We're going down a slippery slope if people cannot hold down a job or pursue their career based on their religious or moral beliefs. If we put the spotlight on everyday Aussies, a lot of people would be out of work. What's your thoughts?
Alan Oster, you know Andrew Thorburn. He was your CEO, wasn't he, before?
Professionally, I know him. So Chief Economist obviously has to talk to the CEO. I don't know him in the social sense. When I used to work with him, he always seemed to be very professional. He put a lot of emphasis on diversity and all those sort of things. So my sort of response is, I really don't know. And I think that is really a question that should be asked to the Essendon Football Club.
But you didn't see where his faith beliefs may have crossed over into his work life?
When I was there, I had no idea that he had strong religious beliefs. And in a bank, you sort of don't know that anyway. I think it's appropriate you don't know.
Well, God and mammon, they say, don't they? Mehreen Faruqi, one of the things that Andrew Thorburn has raised here is the concern that, you know, as Dean said, is this a slippery slope? Should people of faith now fear for their employment? Do you share that concern?
In any workplace, no one should be discriminated for the religious beliefs that they hold. But also, in a workplace, no one has free rein to express bigoted or hateful views as well. I think in this particular case, we have to separate out, I think, everyday Australians working in a workplace to someone who is a leader in their church.
He hadn't said this, and of course the comments had happened before he was chair of the church, but as leader, does he hold a responsibility?
Of course, you are a leader of an organisation which has expressed kind of anti-choice, homophobic views. So, you know, you have to take responsibility for that. And now you are being, you know, asked to be the CEO or are a CEO of an organisation who has different values, an organisation which has had, you know, issues as the whole football industry in terms of racism and homophobia and other discrimination. And this organisation is trying to change for better, to be more inclusive, to be more respectful. So I think that's the difference here. If your values clash or the two positions that you hold, their organization's values clash, then you have to pick one or the other. I think that's what we are experiencing here.
Jonathan Sumption, call on your legal expertise, and this also puts me in mind of what the philosopher Hannah Arendt talked about when she talked about the right to have rights. Who has the right to have rights?
I don't think this is actually a question of rights or a question which law helps one to answer. Personally, I completely agree with the premise of Dean's question. I think that the only relevant question is whether he would be good at the job that he was appointed to. As I understand it, the reason why he was thought to be objectionable was his views on abortion. Abortion is one of the great moral issues of our time. I personally strongly believe that there should be a regulated right of abortion, but I'm certainly not going to say that those who take a morally different view are in some way objectionable or can't be employed by somebody whose function is nothing to do with abortion one way or the other.
Dean, just from the tone of your question, you're concerned that this could spread. Do you share that belief that there are others now who may be vulnerable?
I just think we need to be able to separate your beliefs from... He has a role as the Essendon CEO. It's completely irrelevant what his personal beliefs. I just think, yeah, slippery slope that it shouldn't really be considered I guess the Essendon CEO is a high-profile case, so, but there'll be a lot of people, if you looked at any workforce, that have similar views as Andrew. Does it prevent them fulfilling their role? I'd argue it doesn't.
Amanda Rishworth, does this bring us back to the question about the need for a religious discrimination or anti-discrimination bill, which of course we'd seen debated in the previous parliament and that didn't get anywhere? Does this now increase the urgency to return to that?
Well, I don't know if this specific case suggests that we need to return to this, but I do think we do have to send a strong message, whether it is about sexual orientation, whether it's about race, or whether it is about being able to hold religious beliefs. There should be a right not to be discriminated against, and that right is very important. I think, though, as we talk about rights, there can be a tension between, for example, the right to free speech and how and when that's used and where it crosses over to how it affects others. And I think that's always, when we talk about rights, there's also about a responsibility of how we make others feel.
The problem is, and we saw this with the debate around religious discrimination before, is how do you square that circle? How do you meet all of the demands for inclusion and recognition of rights? For instance, now would someone at a religious school have the right to employ only someone who adheres to those religious beliefs?
Well, that actually does exist across our country, that teachers, religious schools can say that they would like to employ employees that have aligned values. So the circumstance that you talk around values being aligned actually does occur currently. But I think we have to be really clear that people do have the right to hold different beliefs. That is an important part of our multicultural country, our multi-faith country. But we also have a responsibility of how we all take personal responsibility in making sure we think of others as we go about what we do.
Of course, Jonathan, you know, in your country, it's a very diverse country. You also have an equality bill, don't you, a human rights bill. Is that enough to provide the protection necessary?
Yes, it is. In fact, we recently had a big case on this very subject, which concerned differences, very violently expressed differences of opinion about gender reassignment. And our Court of Appeal has ruled that that discrimination in employment on account of a person's beliefs on that subject is forbidden by statute. I personally applaud that decision because I think that we have got to learn to be tolerant of other people's opinions. People in an educated and diverse society are never going to agree about all that much. And life becomes impossible if we are not prepared to tolerate views that we strongly disagree with.
Having views that you disagree with is one thing. I think we all agree that people should be able to express views. However, when they cross over to the line of inciting violence or hate, and as we know, even with regard to, I mean, a lot of lay people talk about rights, and as if the right to free speech, for example, is absolute. It's not. It's always qualified. It's not an absolute right, and for those reasons. And so this is why I think, and I also sort of the language you're using about his leaving his job because of his association with the church. It's not the association with the church per se that's caused
it's the
this.
beliefs.
It's the beliefs. It's the views.
He made a choice. Is that the way these things should be dealt with, Francis? Is there a choice here? Do you end the association with the church, or do you end your employment with Essendon?
Well,
is that what it comes down to?
Ultimately, it comes down to a clash of values, and I think that those two values, those two organisations, are completely incompatible. And one, you can't, it's a sense of cognitive dissonance if you just say, well, that person can hold those, a person can be in those two organisations, and yet be leading an organisation which may have propagated discriminatory or bigotry views, and then on the other hand, you're working for an organisation that says it's inclusive and diverse. Those two things are not compatible. So there has to be a choice here.
And that's the choice you make.
Last month, Senator Pauline Hanson tweeted saying that to Senator Faruqi that to peace off to back to Pakistan. So as a university professor, I was wondering, is it safe actually for me to actually use that, exactly what she said, to use it with my colleagues, to my students? Will I actually still have my job?
Mehreen.
You know, someone like me has heard that said to me hundreds and hundreds of times in my 30 years in Australia. My kids have heard it while they were growing up in school, university, at workplaces. And I know that so many people who contacted me after Senator Hanson said that to me have told me how triggered they have felt. Because what this does is it really pokes and prods at the scars that we already carry because of the incessant racism that is piled on upon us. For me, it was humiliating. It was insulting. And, you know, it really does challenge my belonging to a place that I have called home for 30 years. And I don't think it would be tolerated in any workplace. And I've spoken to many others as well. I have worked in local government. I've worked in a university as well. I've worked in a consulting firm. And I can tell you, they were all, I'm a civil engineer, so they were all very male-dominated white spaces. But I can tell you in none of those spaces have I been made to feel as I feel in my current workplace. And none of those workplaces would have tolerated that. And there would have been consequences for those people who might have said that to another colleague. But here in Parliament, zero consequence. And Senator Hanson has been doing this for decades as well, without any sanctions, without any accountability. So what I tried to do and what the Greens tried to do with the censure motion was to try and hold Senator Hanson to account. But that censure motion was watered down to actually remove the censure. So what kind of message does that send to the rest of the community? Here we are, you know, the so-called leaders in this country who are not willing to call out racism and hold the perpetrator accountable. I think it sends a horrible message, and it basically gives free rein. It actually legitimizes then what happens in, you know, sporting clubs or sporting arenas, and what happened, you know, last week. With, you know, the fascist symbols and, you know, the disrespect, the acknowledgement to country.
We're going to get to that, Francis.
Yeah, I mean, I very much feel, I really do feel for you, because I think that, and again, I think I come at this from the perspective of somebody who is a British citizen, but is also an Australian, a dual Australian national. And if you're telling, and I'm an Australian national, so if somebody says to me, piss off back to where you come from, I'm Australian, you know. Senator Faruqi's kids are probably born here, raised here. They might have brown skin, but if you're telling them to piss off, just think about the underlying assumptions you're making about that person. You're telling them that they don't belong here because they happen to have a brown skin. Yeah, and I said in the UK, I grew up in that sort of environment where people, black, Asian, were being told constantly to piss off back to where they came from. We had, I mean, not long ago, I mean, some years ago, we had a famous Australian, an ex-Olympian, tell Mark Philippoussis to go back to where his parents came from. I mean, not Mark Philippoussis,
Nick Kyrgios.
Nick Kyrgios, sorry. I'm thinking about the wrong guy. Yeah, Nick Kyrgios was told to piss off back to where his parents came from, and he's born here. You know, so so if you cannot see the underlying assumptions there, it's just. What can I say?
Amanda, the question really went to a double standard, didn't it? You're saying that you wouldn't be able to do this in your workplace, Sharif. Why is this allowed in Parliament?
Well, firstly, I wanted to say to Mehreen personally, I'm really sorry you had to endure that, because I can only imagine that if a senator of Australia is enduring it, in fact, it's happening right across the country. And the comments you made, and I can't pretend to understand what it's like, but I have spoken with people that have said that it is very triggering to that sense of belonging. So someone that's been elected to the Australian Senate is in that position is difficult. Of course, we've got to call it out, and I think Senator Penny Wong, who has also experienced, did a blistering speech that really did call it out, but we've got to constantly be calling it out.
But the censure motion, just sorry to interrupt, to go to Mehreen's point, was watered down. Is that calling it out?
Well, I think if anyone listened to what Penny Wong said in her speech, it was blistering. It didn't try and hide the fact that this was racist. It was completely unacceptable and shouldn't be targeted at anyone in Australia, let alone a senator of the Australian Parliament, but shouldn't be tolerated by anyone, because it is triggering and it is very... It doesn't bring people together. And I think Senator Hanson is elected to the Australian Parliament, but we can all call out bad behaviour, and I'm doing that tonight, and I think it was done in the Senate as well.
But words do matter, and I'm really appreciative of the words that Senator Wong used, but actions matter more. And the action for that day was that today we hold this racism to account, and that did not happen. So I have followed on, and I have made a complaint to the Human Rights Commission on the basis of racial discrimination.
Sure, if you wanted to ask something else?
Yeah, I think to me, it's like, it's double standard, and I feel like it's very, very unjust. Like, someone is just taking an exemption for doing, but if I did the same action, I'm totally going to be treated differently. So yeah, calling out is a good thing, but definitely action is totally different.
Amanda, I'm expecting my first child in the next few days, and despite having good jobs, my partner and I are feeling the pinch of interest rate rises and cost of living. Now that you're in government, will you reconsider the stage 3 tax cuts so I can be reassured my child will experience the same or better quality of life his parents have?
Look, thank you very much for that question, and all the best for the birth of your child. Look, it is a really difficult economy that we've inherited. We've got a situation where we've got rising interest rates, we've got rising inflation, and a significant government debt. And really, the debt and the budget we were left was a mess. And
so how can you afford to have tax cuts for people on $200,000?
Well, we are going through... in a responsible way, looking at every bit of spending, every bit of how we tackle tax. For example, we've said we want to focus on multinational tax. But when we look at what we spend, and we've got to be focused on our people, we've got to be focused on productivity and what's good for the economy. So the global circumstances are changing. We're very alive to that. And I think what you'd expect of us...
Is that a no, though? It's a very long answer to what was a very simple question.
Stan, what you would expect of us with a budget coming up, and I know you'd love me to announce the whole budget here tonight. I can't do that. I'll leave that to the Treasurer. But what we're doing is going through the budget process, keeping these very difficult circumstances, taking action where we can, including, for example, childcare and making childcare more affordable in this country, medicines more affordable. We've got to take responsible, targeted action. That's what the Treasurer and the Finance Minister is doing right now, and we'll continue to do that and keep the economic circumstances in place.
Alan, I'll come to you on the economics in just a moment. Suzanne, does that answer your question at all?
I think it is time to reconsider. So we're in a situation now where things are changing rapidly. Things are getting harder. We've just seen in the UK that they haven't done the tax cuts. So I think it's absolutely time to reconsider now. And the things that you're talking about will be a lot easier if you don't do the stage 3 tax cuts.
Suzanne, I think you did say your baby's due in a few days. I think it's due today, isn't it?
Today is the due date, yes.
Today is the due. So good luck. Good luck with that as well. Alan, is it time to scrap them? Is it bad economics?
It's very difficult. I think you need to put... everyone says phase 3 tax cuts. Look what happened in the UK. These are very, very different circumstances. And if I'll sort of give you some numbers, but where I'm going to come to, I think it's a political issue, pure on that. And it's up to how the government does it. So what happened in the UK very quickly is you had a new government came in, they announced a package that was not expected, not independently valued. They've got an independent office that sort of does it, so it wasn't there. Half of the package hasn't actually been announced. So anything on what are they going to do to saving hasn't been announced. It was basically 2 bits. One was taxes. Most of those taxes haven't changed. It's just the top end. And also it was this attempt to stop the prices of electricity going through. And so what happened was the government essentially said, I'm going to go off and borrow 3% of GDP at a time when their government was running a current account deficit of -8, and they had higher levels of debt. And so you had very high inflation, so people in Australia don't realise what you've got in the UK. Bank of England's talking about 13% increase in inflation. Most private sector economists are talking 15 to 20. Okay? And so what the bond market said is, hang on, you guys are doing exactly the reverse of what the Bank of England's trying to do. And so what then happened was the bond dealers got in and said, this just means Bank of England's got to go even higher. That is a very different situation to what we've got here.
But the headwinds are there, aren't they? If we look around the rest of the world, and you've talked about the inflation numbers there, if that's what's coming over the horizon, and we've got a wealth gap, and interest rates keep going up, we're potentially going into a recession ourselves, aren't we?
2024,
yes.
before they even start.
But will we be in a recession by then?
Yeah. So the question about the recession, so I'm going to try and say the optimistic side, because we're always trying to be optimistic. Okay. The optimistic thing to say is we're not overseas. Why? 3 things, 3 really important things. China has a vaccine that doesn't work against Omicron. So whenever they get it, they close it down. Secondly, you've got Europe, where you've got the Russian gas situation. And if you want a statistic that's really going to scare you, they're trying to put a cap at £2,500 per annum. The average British consumer, after tax, earns £20,000. It's about 15% just to turn the lights on. Okay, so that is really a big issue. And then you've got central banks who are out there saying, I'm going to use inflation to get things down. And thing to remember about monetary policy, it takes at least 12 months to work.
Yeah. And we also know it's a very, and I want to bring Mehreen in just on the question of these tax cuts in just a minute, but we also know it's a very blunt instrument.
Yeah.
And right now, a lot of people are being hurt. We're not overseas, but we are in Australia.
Yeah.
We do have a growing wealth gap, interest rates are going up, inflation is going up, and people are concerned
wages
about
are going down.
And wages are going down.
People are very worried about what's going to happen, and everyone seems to think economists just build these fancy models, and no, it's applied psychology within a framework of a model. And what the sort of problem we've got is people say, oh, rates started to go up and nothing's happened. Things are still good. As a big bank, we can see that most people haven't actually got their notice yet or haven't started paying back. You know, they're going to be, even if rates just go up a little bit from here, they're going to be paying off on average $600 per month extra. That is coming. Then you've got also the fact there's a lot of people who took up those fixed loans and they roll over in the middle of next year. So we're going to have a hit to the economy. But we don't think it's going to go into a recession, provided you don't go too far in terms of pushing up rates.
Okay, well, let's go to Mehreen here. At a time when people are going to be paying higher interest rates, when they are concerned potentially about a recession, when they are paying more for food and for petrol and other necessities, is it justified to give people who are on $200,000 a year a $9,000 windfall, because that's how much they'll make with the tax cuts? So what would you be pushing for?
Well, absolutely not. And the Greens have been clear from day one. These taxes, stage 3 tax cuts, made no sense when they were introduced in 2019, and they make even less sense now. And the Greens were really the only party that voted against unwinding a progressive tax system. And, you know, we're sticking to that. As you said, Stan, we are in a place here where inequality is rising. We are in one of the worst housing crises that Australia has ever seen. People have to choose between paying rent or putting food on the table. People have to choose between, paying rent or going to the doctor or the dentist. In what world does it make sense to put more money, $244 billion worth of money, into the pockets of the richest? And also into the pockets of men? That is just going to turbocharge further economic inequality, further gender inequality. And to be really fair, decades of neoliberal economics has done nothing for those most in need. Nothing has trickled down to them, where rivers of gold have flown and will continue to flow if these tax cuts go ahead. But, there is a little bit of a ray of sunshine, I think, somewhere there. There is unrest in the Labour Party, it seems, and that's only
I don't know where you
on these tax cuts, on these I've been reading the newspaper a little bit.
We're not done with the discussion about the economy.
But I think the pressure that is being put on the Labour government from literally everyone in the community, except probably the wealthiest, even some of the wealthiest are saying, we don't need these tax cuts. This is not the time to do it. It's just going to further turbocharge if there are the storm clouds of a recession coming, that's what it's going to do. People are going to suffer more. So we've got to keep the pressure up, folks, and get Labour to commit to scrapping these tax cuts.
Given the complex, conflicted situations represented here tonight, and Lord Sumption's knowledge of history and the situation in Ukraine, how close does he think we are to World War III? And what can we do in our own lives to avert it?
Well, we can't do anything in our own lives to avert it. And it would be a bold man who tried to predict exactly what Mr. Putin was going to do. He is not the most rational or the most consistent or the most predictable actor on the world stage. If I had to guess, I would say that his threat to use nuclear weapons is a bluff because he knows that the consequences for Russia would be appalling. And I'm assuming that he would, if he does choose to use nuclear weapons, it would be low-grade battlefield, so-called munitions, rather than intercontinental ballistic missiles. The latter would plainly be a disaster from which no one would gain. But it seems to me that the prospect of retaliation and the likelihood that that would increase the tempo of the conventional war will probably deter him from doing it. But I may be assuming a degree of rationality in this man which just isn't there. In the late 1930s, a lot of people said that Hitler wouldn't invade Eastern Europe because it would be a crazy thing to do. Well, it was a crazy thing to do, and he did it. And that's the situation we're in. I certainly think that the West, and certainly Europe, cannot afford to allow Putin to take over the Ukraine. Russia has been a predatory autocracy for 3 centuries. It has always considered itself to have a special degree of entitlement in Eastern Europe. If he is allowed to take over the Ukraine, it cannot be assumed that he will stop there, because the whole of Europe, of Eastern Europe and much of Central Europe, is land which at one stage or another in its history, Russia has coveted. In one of the most telling moments of a famous speech that he delivered at the end of last year, Putin cited as the great model for rulers of Russia the 18th century Tsarina of Russia, Catherine the Great. That was a very interesting statement. Catherine the Great swallowed up most of Poland and large parts of what are now Austria and the states to the east of it. And I think that we must assume that unless he gets a bloody nose on Ukraine, that will be his next step.
Madonna, I don't know if that's put your mind at first. I think the short answer is we're in a perilous situation. We have to wonder what Vladimir Putin is going to do next, but certainly a good question. We will no doubt come back to that question in future programs as well. I want to thank you all for tonight. That's all the time we have. Thanks to our panel: Jonathan Sumption, Mehreen Faruqi, Amanda Rishworth, Francis Awaritefe, and Alan Oster. thank you to those of you here and at home for driving the conversation. We almost had a Q&A baby, Susanna, but good luck in the days ahead. And next week we'll be live in Sydney. You'll have the chance to put your questions to, among others, consumer advocate and environmental activist Erin Brockovich. That'll be a treat. Yes, the real Erin Brockovich, not the movie. Was it Julia Roberts? Yeah, not Julia Roberts. That story, of course, is brought to life by Julia Roberts in that feature film, so it'll be a real chance to sit down and put those questions to Erin. Head to our website. You can register to be in the audience. Until then, thanks for your questions again. Thanks for the answers. Good night.